Few events have stimulated External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar's gift of the gab as much as the Ukraine war. So every time he's interviewed on India's stand on the war or the decisions surrounding it, the global commentariat is set ablaze. Everybody talks about it. Why? First, because yes, India's voice matters. Second, because there is a need to demystify these statements to understand the country's real strategic positioning in a fast-changing world. Its many perils aside, the Ukraine war has been an enabler of conversations between the West and the rest of the world. In the case of India and Europe, for instance, it has brought to fore differing perceptions on critical issues of statehood, security, and international law on the one hand, and rational choice hedging on the other. At the heart of it is colonial rancor as well, which is inalienably etched into the psyche of a nation, its riches plundered and its territory dismembered as it sought to find a footing in a fractured post-colonial South Asia. Entwined therein is the West's at times emphatic and at other times gentle indifference to India's security anxieties. Now, this indifference is often laced with the Western press's apathy towards India's commitment to regional stability and global peace. A lot of it, though, remains a narrative, and narratives change when national interests deem fit. So, let's review the 2 years of Jaishankar's astuteness. When the war had just started and the West expected India to take a principled stand with them, Dr. Jaishankar reminded the leaders that Europe's problems are not the world's problems, especially when vice versa has not been true. I'm sure everybody has heard of that statement. Now, 2 years later, again speaking in Japan, he once again rebutted the West's selective interpretation of principles of sovereignty, calling it cherry picking. True to New Delhi's preferred country agnosticism, that means that we do not like to take names of certain countries, these loaded statements hint at Pakistan and China without taking names. At a more fundamental level, this is about legitimate Indian frustration about the West choosing to sidestep India's territorial vulnerabilities, earlier by quoting Pakistan, of course, and later by maintaining trade ties with China. It is discomforting to India that none of its Western partners, including our partners like Japan, cartographically means on the map, acknowledge Kashmir as a part of the Indian country. While the West has developed a more nuanced approach to this issue lately, in India it is regarded as fence-sitting. But you know what? These statements don't really have an absolutist position. They are not absolute truths. It is also true that part of this response stems from India's preferred bilateral approach to its territorial issues, which rejects third-party mediation whatsoever. Therefore, the play of these words can be better addressed by increasing the sheer frequency of dialogue and demystifying narratives in the space that has emerged after the debacle in Ukraine. So the first point is that Dr. Jaishankar should be asked some intelligent questions. Questions with a simplistic interpretation of India's stand in the war dump down the larger role our country is playing in the conflict. For example, it's a pity that every single time someone as ingenuous as Jaishankar is speaking on the war in the West, he lands up fielding the same tone-deaf questions, lacking in nuance and ignorant to India's seething experiences with territorial concerns on actually both sides of its continental expanse, on the one side Pakistan, on the other side China. Instead, the West could use these platforms to enhance its understanding of India's proactive and humanitarian neutrality in the war. Actually, it's high time that they do it. So what should be discussed more are the 15 consignments of humanitarian aid that is already sent to Ukraine by India, making India one of the most bankable players for post-conflict reconstruction. It would be also much more useful to note that India has a thriving and agile business community that would be keen to invest in a war-torn country whenever the time is right. So demystifying monoliths on both sides is what is needed. Ukraine war has been demystifying redundant narratives as well. And that is why I call it an enabler of conversations that didn't exist before. But we need to pick the right conversations also. So instead of worrying about coaching India to join them in criticizing Russia, the Western strategic community needs to internalize the very security imperatives and responses thereof that have landed Delhi in such a spot. Moreover, it also needs to respect that India acts in strategic autonomy. Its relations with Moscow are built on a different set of historical, geopolitical, and technical factors. And despite these linkages, India intervened with swift action when news of Indian nationals being forced by Russian agents to fight on the front lines came to notice. India, for its part, also needs to acknowledge that Europe is no monolith either. India also suffers from that. Endeavours should be made to distinguish between official positions that are increasingly favourable to New Delhi and the unfavourable perceptions of the press, which is a different story. India needs to also better accept that the West takes pride in the culture of dissent, and the policy of multi-alignment is as valid for other players as it is for us. Further, think of a vastly important maritime domain such as the Indo-Pacific. The European view, in congruence with India's, is to bolster multipolarity and a third way forward for countries wary of escalating great power rivalry between the United States on the one hand and China on the other, all of it while continuing to engage with India at the forefront. New Delhi, too, needs to reassess its growing degree of consilience, which is congruence, with Europe's view of the international order in maritime domains more synergistically. The other point is that India's neutrality has been a global asset. How is that? A neutral India is far more useful to the West than an aligned one. It is because of India's neutrality and acting in its national interest that it decided to buy discounted Russian oil, thereby allowing the G7 price cap to work. Lest it is forgotten, one of the objectives of the price cap was to ensure the flow of Russian oil to other parts of the world, so that dangerous spikes in oil prices don't wreak havoc in an already wrecked world. So had it not been for India's consistent buying of Russian oil, no way could the global rerouting be made possible. And this also explains why, after initial condescending statements from some US officials, no US or European official ever asked India to stop buying Russian oil. Again, the press did, and Jaishankar responded with alacrity, saying Europe buys in one afternoon what India buys in 1 year. Again, a tone-deaf question elicited a similar response. But what got missed in the process yet again was the value of India's neutrality for the West. Finally, there is an ideational element as well. Epistemic resistance against Eurocentrism is the fair thing to do. India is invested in reclaiming and rethinking the part of history that is its own. The right to take relevant conversations forward in today's geopolitics should be accorded to the agency itself, like India here, not dropped like Newton's apple as a priori for the rest of us to accept. Colonized India saw its soldiers fight and die alongside allies' armies in the two world wars, and yet India bore the brunt of cartographic blunders, faced sanctions from the West, except France, of course, in 1974 and in 1998. Geopolitics has fundamentally changed ever since. States' behavior is not fixated, but is now a functional response to these geopolitical forces and therefore liable to change. When it comes to picking right conversations, of course, timing is also key. West and India's relationship has been riding the high tide, despite the differences in worldviews and experiential distillates that often translate into a colloquial expression of mistrust. The reality is much more nuanced. From diversified weapon platforms to trade, investments, AI, technology, innovation, remittances, diaspora, India's relations with the West are thriving. So is New Delhi's rising diplomatic profile in regions untouched in the European continent. India's outreach to the Baltics, for example, and Mediterranean Europe, its rising presence in the Caucasus, which is Armenia, Azerbaijan, the reinvigorated defense diplomacy in Central Europe, particularly Poland and Spain, and fresh engagement with the Balkans, countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina. All of these speak a different story. Similarly, Europe's outreach to the Indo-Pacific, renewed political will at maximizing the growing economic heft of India through difficult but persistent trade negotiations, and appointing a defense attaché in New Delhi. These are engagements that were unthinkable until a very few years ago. These prove that common and long-term interests are critical in creating and sustaining frameworks of cooperation. India's commitment to neutrality demands a better understanding because it stems from its position of enhanced global traction. More importantly, there is genuine merit in a collaborative framework of partnering that is based on commitments to commons and not in a zero-sum framework of alliances. That is how the West usually operates, right? Foreign policy imperatives are never alike. Maximizing convergences while co-opting divergences is the key to shaping relevant conversations between India and its partners. The link to my piece is given in the description box as always. I'll be back to track how India shapes its relevant strategic conversations in a very fluid world. Stay tuned.